everyone, this is Fred from Profile Prague, and today I'm extremely fortunate to talk with one of my favorite artists, Team Bowness. How are you doing, Tim?
I'm very well, thank you.
Hey, I'll start with the most common question nowadays. How's the COVID era treating you?
Um, I think it's in some ways too complex a question for me to really answer, and certainly answer effectively. But of course, it's put a great number of restrictions and difficulties on everybody's lives, and of course has brought a great deal of anguish to many as well. So it is one of those situations where obviously globally, I think we've all experienced it, and we probably all have opinions and strong feelings as a result of it.
All right.
I mean,
Late night. Oh,
yeah. So I was going to, if you, in specific, I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that I live in one of the areas of the United Kingdom with the lowest infection and death rate of all, and it's been that way since the beginning. So in that sense, luckily, I don't know of people who have been infected or have died, and that's been a big positive, of course.
but the restrictions is still there, right? Like,
To an extent, they are. Yeah, we're on what I think they would regard as a reduced
yeah.
lockdown, effectively. But yeah, during the early months, I think we were allowed to leave our house to walk or to go to the shop. But yeah, in that sense, it is being lifted. And as I've said, luckily, perhaps because the area was not very badly affected in the first place, it's not very badly affected at the moment either.
Good, good. Uh, Late Night Laments,
Hmm.
Laments,
Yeah.
is your brand new solo album, but more importantly, this is five album in 6 years. That is quite impressive, and this is while you work on other projects. So explain how you achieve being so creative.
It's very difficult because it doesn't feel like that when you're in the middle of creating, because quite often I kind of feel as if I'm not doing enough. And I've often kind of put this down, the more recent prolific activity, to the fact that I had a child about 10 years ago. And that makes you feel even more aware of your mortality and your limited time on Earth. And I think that, as well as kind of uncovering all sorts of emotions, it in some way acts as a means of propelling you to create, and having a need to create. But I mean, with this album, for example, I suppose, looking at the timeline, I wrote the first track for this, One Last Call, in August of 2019. And that was actually a full year after I'd last written a song which had been on Flowers at the Scene. Although, of course, in that year, I'd been writing and rewriting and re-recording bits for No Man's Love You to Bits. So it's been a kind of a combination, really, of sometimes reassessing older work, which has been really creative, because the No Man album was great fun to do, and was actually a very creative project rather than nostalgic. And the same a few years back when I worked on an album with Brian Hulse and David Jones, which was Plenty, which was my pre-No Man band. And rather than being a sort of moribund recreation of our early work, it actually turned out to be, in its own way, quite instructive, sort of reintroducing us to ways of working, singing, writing, and then provoking new approaches. And I think this is the whole thing, that sometimes I find going back to the past can be an amazing creative trigger in the present, that it makes you think again about how you're doing, and sometimes actually kind of stops you from being complacent.
Love it, love it. So the new album is being released on August 28th, which is just a few more days to wait. Again, it's titled Late Night Laments. What's your current state of mind toward the release and the fans' response? Like, are you anxious, excited?
It's an odd one with this because I think that the last few albums have, to a certain extent, um, challenged people's view of what my music might be. I mean, Lost in the Ghostlight was perhaps the most overtly progressive album I ever did because it related very specifically to the theme,
Yeah.
which was about a kind of a 70s progressive artist. And in a way, I always kind of see that as being an album about the album, you know, because I always see the album as being a real artistic statement of intent. And I think I've said in the era of streaming, I tend to put even more effort into the sonic detail and cover artwork relating to my material than I've ever done, you know. Um, and Flowers at the Seam was a much more dynamic and eclectic album. Love You to Bits was perhaps even more so dynamic in its own way, and quite an unexpected departure for people who'd been following No Man of late. And this is, in a way, a kind of it's a return to a melancholy emotional area that I've worked in before, but I think it's a return to that area with the benefit of 10 years of experience. And so what I've found is that the use of sounds, the way in which I sing, the lyrical subjects are all very different from when I kind of last did an album that was um, coherent and coherently melancholy in the way that this album is.
Nice. You quickly talked about like concept albums. So is there one particular to the new album or a theme?
Well, I think this is kind of conceptual in the same way that Abandoned Dancehall Dreams was. In that there isn't a narrative story, you know, there's no arc, there's no story, but I kind of see that the cover is a fantastic realization of what the album's about in a way, because I sort of saw it as being somebody in their comfortable world of music,
Yeah.
art, books, and somewhere in the background, 24-hour news is buzzing, coming in, and slapping reality in your face. And in that way, the songs are quite eclectic and very contemporary in terms of their sort of global significance. And when I'd finished the album, I was quite worried because, of course, I'd finished the album on the day that lockdown was announced in Britain, and suddenly everything seemed irrelevant in the face of this virus that everyone was um, having to confront. And what was interesting is that as the lockdown went on and as the period of the pandemic went on, that a lot of the themes that I've been discussing, from generational divides to hate crimes onwards, actually were becoming more prominent in the news than they were previously. And that was one of the interesting things that, you know, from feeling that I'd made something that seemed irrelevant, bizarrely by the time of release, it seems that a lot of those themes are very much in the news again, or they've been exacerbated by the virus in some ways.
Yeah.
Because we said in Britain, you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the pandemic has highlighted divisions in society, you know, whether that's between, you know, whether it's racial divisions or divisions in terms of wealth and fairness. And it's kind of interesting that these things have been highlighted and suddenly seem to be getting an awful lot worse because of them rather than better. So a lot of these themes of, as I said, generational divides, inequality, hate crimes, weirdly have become speaking points now.
I actually took a close look to the album cover. You mentioned the album cover.
Mm,
It's beautiful. But I was
thank you.
actually trying to find album like the vinyl's album cover to see if I would recognize any. But I saw like a news or a magazine saying Prague something.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought it was great, great stuff.
Well,
Well,
what
what
happened with that
happened with that
originally?
originally?
One of the
One of the
nice
nice
things
things
about this
about this
album
album
is
is
more
more
so than
so than
kind
kind
of
of
any
any
album I've
album
already
I've already
done
done
recently.
recently.
Um,
Um,
it just seemed to work from the beginning. As I said, I wrote this piece, One Last Call, and it was very late on at night, and I was even singing the lyric into the early hours of the morning, and it had a particular feel and a particular use of sound. And I thought this would be really interesting to make an album that kind of explored one emotional territory. Whereas Flowers at the Scene have been quite eclectic and Love You to Bits have been pummelingly dramatic, I wanted to do something much more introspective, quiet, and just, in a sense, investigate one particular set of moods. Although, as I said, the lyrics are quite diverse. And with the cover, again, it was one of the odd things that um, I had the title for the album almost straight away, and I had what I wanted as the image for the cover almost straight away. I could see it in my mind. And then I explained this to Jared Gosling, who does all of the artwork for my albums. He paints everything. And it then just became incredible fun as the two of us would kind of layer detail after detail after detail. And probably the only other cover that matches that is Lost in the Ghostlight, which has an awful lot of detail. But interestingly enough, with the album cover that you talk about, originally we both suggested all sorts of album covers that were either albums that I loved to listen to late at night, or albums that I loved to lose myself in the world of, or albums that might have influenced the direction of the artwork. And we finished it, and it had a lot of actual albums in there, but we were told by Sony's lawyers not to do it. So Jared had to go over every single album and do some kind of imagined uh, version of the album we were talking about, so some kind of fictional version of the album we were talking about. So in quite a lot of cases, you will see the album covers, but slightly removed to the point where they can't be wholly recognizable, and no band names and images are used as a result.
I see. Again, the lineup for the album is quite impressive. How do you choose your musicians to take part on your projects?
Well, I think sometimes it's having a very strong idea of a musician who will be able to enhance the music. So, in this case, there were three musicians that were just perfect for the pieces I chose them for. So, Evan Carson, who's a percussionist who works with I Am the Morning and works with quite a number of folk artists in Britain. He played live with me on a couple of occasions, and he's a wonderful percussionist who can make music that really has a groove and really moves, but actually is very, very subtle. So he propels the music forward without ever interfering with it. And so I'd wanted to work with him for a long time, and a couple of tracks on this album were perfect vehicles for his talent. Somebody I'd used on my last album, Tom Atherton, is a great rock drummer, but he's also a classical percussionist. And when either myself and Brian Hulse were writing the material for the album, for whatever reason, we were constantly drawn to marimbas and vibraphones and just tuned percussion. And luckily, Tom turns out to be a trained marimba player, trained vibraphone player. So he replaced a lot of the samples with real playing. And then for people like Richard Barbieri, Richard is somebody I've worked with in the past, but I think he's one of the most original keyboard players of all time in terms of his use of sound. But one of the things that's kind of underrated about Richard is that he's a brilliant soloist. To me, he's in the league of somebody like Adrian Belew or Robert Fripp, in that he just crafts these kind of sonic assaults, which are also solos. And so there are a couple of tracks that really suggested Richard's style, and luckily he agreed to that. And on bass, I've got Colin Edwin, and Colin's been on all of my solo albums. And Colin's, he's a versatile, sensitive, brilliant bass player. But again, what a lot of people don't know about Colin is that he actually trained as an acoustic jazz player.
Oh,
And so on this album, I've actually got him playing acoustic double bass whenever he plays. And again, for him, I think he was quite pleased to do this because not a lot of people ask him to do that. And this is, part of his training. And, it's a very sensitive, very imaginative player. So, it's a combination of players I've worked with for a long time, or people who you think he's going to enhance this, he's going to bring it out even further. And one of the players on this, which was very last minute, was Carvis Tarabi, who's in Gong and Knife World. And I've known Carvis for years, and he's a wonderful musician, and he thinks about music in a way I don't. His harmonic language is totally different from mine. And I wanted a particular guitar solo on one of the tracks, and I hadn't found what I was looking for. And he emailed me just at the point when I was getting kind of desperate, and just sent me a link to his new album. And I thought, that's the person I want. And so I just said, look, do you fancy doing this? And within a couple of days, he'd added his guitar solo, which is a wonderful thing. And then also got Mel, who's in his band Knife World, to sing backing vocals on a few tracks, because I wanted a very specific female backing vocal on a few of the tracks. And it was really nice because I didn't think I was going to get that, and I didn't think I was going to get the guitar solo. And this was, kind of late February, early March, the very last days of recording the album. And so his email popped into the inbox at just the right time.
yeah, and she has a beautiful voice. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and it was it's marvelous having these people on the music as well, because I've not worked with them previously. But in terms of other artists on other albums, when I've used people like Jim Mathias, for example, who's in Fate's Warning. Jim asked me to sing on an OSI track years ago, and so it was a kind of returning the favour years later. But also, Jim is a great kind of jazz and classical player, and I wanted to provide him with a context that was very different from what he'd do in Fate's Warning. And so, it would be hopefully of interest to him. So, this is what happens really. You use players where there's kind of an element of they're going to bring something different to this and it will be different for them, or they're exactly the right voice. And generally speaking, what kind of happens is if somebody plays on the music, I ask them for a specific part and then say, do what you think the piece needs. So you get a couple of different approaches, and often it's 50-50. You draw from each approach because, as much as I want my ideas realized, I also want to be surprised. And so that's why it's always useful having different takes. So with someone like Richard, he would have given 3 very different solos to the tracks, one of them being close to what I'd originally asked for. And you say it's always a combination of what's been asked for and then what the musician brings to it.
Cool. Very interesting. Very. Correct me if I'm wrong, but while listening to the promo we received, though you're very well known, to produce moody, emotional, peaceful melodies, I noticed that as the album progresses, the music and the lyrics gets a little darker and more melancholic. Am I wrong?
Well, it's difficult to know. I don't know whether I can... the sequencing is very important to me. So album sequencing. This was the one thing that didn't happen immediately. It actually took me 27 times to get this right in terms of sequencing it for the balance I wanted, because I'd written about 53 minutes of music, and the music, as I said, it all came either from myself and Brian Hulse, who's my co-producer on this. And from that 53 minutes of music, I wanted to create a focused album, and it took me 27 times to get the length and the focus right. And you may well be right about that. I mean, I was listening to it as a kind of an emotional experience and as a dynamic experience. But yes, it certainly one of the bleakest songs on the album is close to the end of this, and that's the last getaway.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't think any of the tracks are necessarily joyous lyrically. As I said, in some ways, it's like the album cover. It's somebody who's almost lost in that beautiful world of art, whether it's that favorite album or that favorite book, and reality is there in the background. And what you have, in a sense, perhaps, is always this dark global reality, but filtered through an individual. I suppose in some ways, because obviously, although I'm telling these very different stories about very different people, they're all coming through me and coming through, my world of privilege or whatever.
Yeah. Is it important for you to surprise the fans, like, or do you want them to know what they can expect with the new music coming from you?
I think it's important to surprise yourself, really. I think that the big thing for me is, and what you alluded to earlier about this idea of producing 6 albums in 5 years or however many it is that way, is that I've never been a believer in releasing things for the sake of things or doing things for the sake of things. There's got to be a passion, there's got to be a purpose. And so all of these albums I felt were different from what I'd done before, or I was excited by them. And with this, for example, once I'd hit on One Last Call, I sort of knew what I wanted to do with this album, and it felt different. There are always going to be similarities because, of course, it's my voice, it's my personality. But I hope that with all of the albums, there's a difference in terms of the musical focus, the emotional focus, because there is no point really in kind of repeating yourself ad infinitum. And I've gone through periods of not doing very much. So, for example, in the mid 2000s, I didn't release anything for about 4 years. Also in the early 2010s, I think there's about 2 or 3 years where I didn't do anything. And that's partly because I felt that what I was coming up with wasn't interesting enough for me to pursue, or wasn't different enough, or didn't excite me. So yeah, I think it's more that case of feeling emotionally fulfilled myself, and then hoping that translates to an audience, and hoping that people feel the music, because it's got to come from a genuine place, really.
Yeah, perfect. Do you read critiques and reviews?
Yeah, I mean, I keep abreast of everything because I think I kind of have to. I sort of, chronicle what comes in as it comes in, and it is interesting because this is now referring to what your actual question was at one point about being excited or interested in response.
Hmm.
When we did when I did Lost in the Ghostlight, I genuinely didn't know what people would think, because in some ways it was quite an overt, almost traditionally progressive album for me. And as I said, that related very specifically to what the album was about and the period in which the album was set. And that was quite different. And so I was interested in how people may respond to that. And ditto Flowers at the Scene was suddenly a complete reversal and a much more dynamic album. And of course, with No Man's Love You to Bits, this was, in some ways, I think we've called it the disco epic or the disco symphony, which could not be more different from Lost in the Ghostlight. So, of course, it's always kind of fascinating to know how people will respond to this, or whether they'll connect with it emotionally. And this album, yes, because I suppose there have been 5 albums which have been much more musically diverse and dynamic in a way. And while this is concentrating in a more focused emotional territory, of course, it may receive negative as well as positive responses, and that interests me. But as I said, ultimately you have to do what you need to do
Yeah.
emotionally, and what you want to put out. And if the album is very well received, of course I'm going to be happy, because it's something that means an awful lot to me. If it isn't well received, I'm still going to be happy, because it's the album I wanted to make. And one of my rules of music is, you produce what you passionately believe in, and you put it out there. And once it's out there, you try and promote it with as much vigor as you can, because it's something that you believe in. And if you truly believe in that music, if the response is positive or negative, it doesn't affect your core creativity. And I think the opposite of that is when you actually do things actually to get responses, or you do things to get success, and sometimes produce mediocre work that you think, okay, this will do it. And certainly, No Man was signed in the early to mid 1990s to quite a number of major independent and major companies, and we dealt with bands who clearly were kind of creating music for a market. And I can never kind of live with that, this idea that you'd produce something for a market, because if it succeeds, you're going to feel as if you've let yourself down, you've let your vision down.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it. Uh, you're well known for numerous collaborations and projects. No Man, you've mentioned, appears right on top of that list, but there's so many more to talk about. I'm curious, like, on how you pick which project you'll take part of and what not. So can you take us through the process?
It depends what project it is, really, because they start from different. Well, they've all got different starting points. So if you talk about Henry Fool, for example, that was something where obviously I mainly sing, but I also write on guitar, and I write on keyboard, write on ukulele even. And with Henry Fool, I'd just written a lot of kind of guitar instrumentals, which were completely outside of what I did with any other project. And at the time, I'd been doing some work with Stephen Bennett, and Stephen Bennett is a very good musician who's contributed to No Man music. And he just said, right, this is interesting. Why don't we record this? Why don't we record these instrumentals? And then we took that idea further, where we just went into the studio with a group of interesting musicians. And the thing is that because I was playing guitar and I was clearly the weakest instrumentalist, generally speaking, I don't play on my albums, because when you're working with people like Stephen Wilson, you don't need to play guitar. You've already got your great guitar player. So generally speaking, I think I'm only on about 3 or 4 No Man tracks, playing keyboards or bits of arpeggio guitar, or what have you, because I've had no need to. So Henry Fool kind of grew out of me writing a lot of guitar instrumentals, which were completely different from anything else I was doing. Something like Memories of Machines came out of the fact that I'd worked with Giancarlo Era. He'd asked me to contribute to an album of his, and the song proved to be quite successful on the album, and he just sent me a few more pieces, and then gradually over the years it was obvious that an album had resulted from that. Centrosum, which was a German project from the early 2000s, that was something where they'd contacted me, asked me to work with them, invited me over to Germany, and we improvised for about 3 or 4 days. And this was a very electronic music with Markus Reuter and Bernhard Heinrich. And had the results not been interesting to us, we probably wouldn't have released it. So it varies. It can come from people asking me to be a part of a project, or maybe I've got these ideas that don't really fit anything that I'm doing, and that was certainly how Henry Fool came about.
You don't seem to shy away from being like a progressive rock artist in most of your projects, but we all know that many artists nowadays they tend to, or they rather not being represented as such. So what's your take on that subject?
It's a difficult thing because I mean, progressive rock was something that I loved. I always had quite eclectic musical taste, and I think that I've been doing a podcast with Stephen Wilson called The Album Years, and in some ways we did this. This was our kind of pandemic project, you know, and it was us giving back to music what music had given to us because we'd always been huge fans. And so for us, you know, we'd been fans of classical music, jazz music, prog music, um, new wave music, electronic music. It was all in the bag, but certainly, you know, a number of those progressive artists were amongst my favourites when I was growing up, and it's been an absolute honour, you know, to be on music that features people like Robert Fripp or Steve Hackett and so on. So I'd never shy away from it in the sense that I loved those albums and I still love those albums. So for me, progressive music is definitely a part of my DNA. But I kind of think that I'm not sure whether my music, with the exception of Henry Fool and Lost in the Ghostlight, is what you'd call conventional progressive music. For me, the spirit of progressive was always about people combining unusual textures, unusual eclectic types of music. You know, if you listen to something like Close to the Edge, it's astonishing. You know, it's a marriage of so many different influences in which you can even hear, you know, from singer-songwriter to classical to even country and western, because you can hear in Steve Howe's playing, Chet Atkins. You know, these guys are drawing from so many sources to make a unique music. So for me, the legacy of progressive is trying anything that works, is finding yourself in a unique space and not being embarrassed by what you like. So, you know, the fact that Steve Howe rates Chet Atkins as his favorite guitarist, fantastic, because what he then brings to Yes is so unique as a rock band when it's colliding with Stravinsky-esque themes or cutting-edge rock energy in 1972. So that's, for me, the lasting legacy, that basically you've got to find yourself somewhere that's interesting and draw from whatever inspires you. And whatever inspires you could be, you know, contemporary R&B or electronic with modern classical. It's just that idea of putting something together that's quite fresh, quite unexpected, and so yeah. So I think that a few of, you know, Henry Fool was the thing, because if I've ever written in progressive styles, it was sometimes because of my kind of having listened to some of progressive artists when I was younger. I can just sit down with a guitar and write something in 25/8 as a kind of it's almost like an exercise. I'm just kind of doing this, and it's clearly a kind of a misspent childhood listening to the likes of, you know, anything King Crimson, yes, but also Steve Reich, Philip Glass, that kind of minimalist classical composer as well. So these things just kind of filter through. But yes, I think the spirit of progressive can be in different places at different times in history. So, you know, if Yes and King Crimson are doing that in the 1970s, and King Crimson are still doing it in the 1980s alongside anyone from, you know, Peter Gabriel, Brian Eno, and so on. It could be Bjork in the 1990s. It could be even Kanye West in 2008. You know, the spirit of progressive is in different places at different times, I think. But yeah, I don't shy away because, of course, I still have a respect for the great prog rock innovators.
Yeah. What's your role in Burning Shed?
Well, Burning Shed was something that kind of started from an idea I had, and it started with originally myself and Peter Chilvers. We had an idea for a label that would put out experimental side projects. So quite a number of musicians we worked with had any number of projects they were working on. They just couldn't get released, partly because they weren't kind of financially viable for them. And so it was almost kind of creating a home for albums that we thought were worthwhile, that didn't have, you know, the kind of financial muscle that would interest a record company. And I originally it was called Burning Shed because we used to burn CDs. So we created this online on-demand platform. But luckily, very quickly, it sold a lot more than we thought, because we created this platform where if you sold 10, it would break even. And some of these early releases were selling in the hundreds and thousands. And so then it became a more conventional label in terms of releasing CDs. And around that time, No Man put out its album Together with Stranger on Kscope. And so Burning Shed, because it was an e-commerce company, started to host started to host No Man's store. That then led to Stephen saying, "Oh, do you want to do Porcupine Trees while you're at it?" So that then led to Porcupine Tree, which then led to actually Kscope and Snapper asking us, because they could see that we were fulfilling this. And it all was lucky, because it was kind of me coming in with a name and an idea, Peter Chilvers being one of the few people at that time who could set up an e-commerce site, because it's difficult to imagine from the vantage point of 2020, but in 1999 when the idea first came about, but 1999, 2000, there weren't that many people who had experience with e-commerce.
Absolutely. Mm.
And he had been responsible for the Play.com site. And Play.com at the time were the biggest competitors to Amazon, certainly in Britain. And then Pete Morgan got involved, and Pete Morgan had his own record company, had his own kind of mini pressing plant, and he was winding down his record company. So he had the space, he had the facilities, and he had the business knowledge as well. So it was a great combination of me with the idea and contacts, Pete with the facilities and business nous, and Peter Chilvers at that time being able to create the perfect site for what we wanted. And we were really lucky about the timing. And it's always kind of evolved through word of mouth, really. And, luckily we're now at a stage where we've got over 100,000 active subscribers to our newsletter. It really has grown quite immensely. And for years, I used to approach bands, either of artists I'd worked with, like King Crimson, or people I admired, Andy Partridge, XTC, and quite a number of the artists we deal with, because we now do official stores for Yes as well, would have been pursued for many, many years, and then it happened. So it's been a combination of good luck, word of mouth, and a fair bit of hard work in terms of just pursuing people. So it's quite interesting, with a band like Yes, whose store we've been doing for the last couple of years, that would have been perhaps after 8 years of persistent email and being irritating. So I think we have an ability to be irritating and persistent as well.
Well, congratulations, because Burning Shed is, for us prog fans, is one of the most important platform, for sure.
Thank you. Well, I think this is the thing that again, I think that it has to work kind of artistically, that everything's sort of come either by word of mouth or as a result of people we've worked with and creatively admire, or thinking, I really like that band, they'd work well in this family of bands. And what's really nice is that there's also an eclecticism. So we don't only deal with some of the biggest and most wonderful, artists in progressive, because again, another band that I pursued for years and eventually ended up working with the main man, Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull, fantastic band who I'd liked from being very young. But we also work with XTC and some of the Japan variants, and Thomas Dolby we worked with for a while. So we've worked with quite different types of music. But I think that one of the things that whether we work with classical musicians like Andrew Keeling or jazz musicians like Theo Travis or rock bands, there's a shared idealism. And I think that we've built up quite a curious customer base as well, because I think that a lot of the customers like us don't only like one thing, but they're attracted by idealism, by creativity. So if there is a link, it's idealism and creativity is the link. And again, not doing something because it's going to sell a lot. It's been a very slow burn thing, and it's kind of interesting because a few years into Burning Shed, a lot of the major companies who dealt with us were really reluctant to deal with us. Now they come to us, So it has changed quite a lot really over the years.
Okay, very cool. I have few more questions, but they
Yeah.
only require one word or
Ah,
couple word answers.
you'll never get a one-word answer out of me.
Well, let's try.
Go
Uh,
on.
you personally, are you more into digital, CDs, or vinyls?
So you want to go one word. Physical is what I'll say to that. I still actively buy CDs mostly and vinyl, partly because I know the damage that streaming is doing to the music industry and to artists in particular. And partly because I kind of prefer investing in a physical item because I think that I give it more time and I become more immersed in it. And it's one of the reasons why when I put out releases, artwork is ever more important, sonic detail is ever more important because you've got to justify people investing in your music. So yeah, I use streaming and digital purely for research purposes, but I still very regularly buy CDs and vinyl.
What's your favorite progressive rock album of all time?
Close to the Edge.
Great one. Growing up, who was your favorite singer?
I kind of had three or four on this, three, four, or five. Um, Peter Hamill was certainly a major influence. I loved his originality. You know, when I was a young teenager, I found his album Over in a store in Manchester, and it moved me profoundly. So I'd say um, Peter Hamill, Peter Gabriel, David Bowie, Kate Bush, Joni Mitchell.
Wow. Do you recall what was the first album you've purchased?
Yeah, that one was probably, it depends where you take it, but when I first got into music, I was really into film music. So I loved John Barry's film music. I loved Bernard Herrmann's film music for Hitchcock. And I remember that I had a kind of a best of John Barry and a Jeff Love Orchestra plays the big Bond themes. So those were kind of, I had a lot of film music albums, but in terms of pop music, it probably was 10cc, the original soundtrack.
Cool. One word to describe late night lament.
Sad sack.
You've worked with so many great artists through your career, dead or alive. Who would you dream of playing with, music with?
Oh, crikey. I mean, yeah, if I had a band, it's interesting because a lot of my favorite players still come from sort of maybe the 50s to the 80s. Because I think, you know, we still have an era in which there are exciting and brilliant albums being made, but there aren't as many distinctive instrumentalists in my view. And I think a golden age of great jazz players and fusion players and rock players you had in sort of, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, of course, I'd love to do some, you know, Miles Davis, Joe Zawinul of Weather Report. These are amazing musicians, also with a great sound. Um, in terms of drummers, actually, there's an American jazz drummer called Brian Blade. I'd love to work with. So he's alive. um, and again, in terms of drummers, people like Manu Katché has such an original approach to the drum. So there's a few people that it would be just wonderful um, to get on albums. Of course, it would be fantastic to get somebody like Brian Eno to produce an album. In terms of players I've worked with, you know, there's no doubt that working with Robert Fripp
Oh,
was a great thrill. And if I was having that best of group, you know, if you're creating your dream group, he probably still would be my guitarist. You know, he's such an astonishing musician. And when he worked with No Man, it was as if music was flowing through him. He just couldn't stop spewing it out. And that was a glorious thing to observe, really. In terms of my bass player, I love a German bass player called Eberhard Weber, and he's a jazz bass player who's done quite a lot of albums on the ECM label, a German jazz label, but he's also done the very occasional kind of pop rock session, and so he worked on a couple of Kate Bush albums, and he's just a beautifully expressive player. And although he plays a kind of an upright bass, it's an electric upright bass, so it's a weird combination almost of fretless electric and acoustic double bass that he plays, and beautiful sound. And then of course that leads me to Jaco Pastorius, who again has to be one of my favorite players of all time.
I'm gonna check it out for sure. I have one more.
Go on.
Next album will be No Man or Tim Bowness?
At this stage, and this is an interesting thing to say, I honestly don't know.
Okay.
When I was making this album, I felt really compelled to create it and complete it. So, as I said, weirdly, compared to a lot of the other albums, this was written in 2 short, intense bursts of activity in late 2019 and early 2020. And when I'd finished it, I've no idea why. I mean, when I was making this album, to go back to your question about the pandemic, when I was making the album, I had a real overwhelming sense of something not good this way a coming. And the first song I wrote in 2020, which is a kind of about generational divides, once I'd finished it, it's called We Caught the Light. Once I'd finished it, I really felt as if this year was not going to be a good one. And I was very aware from the beginning of reports coming in from China, for example, Wuhan. And so I followed that progress from the 20th of the front page to the entire first 10 pages of the paper with interest. And I don't know whether that kind of affected my mood or the intensity of the music or even my desire to create it, because I did feel really quite compelled to create and complete this music. But once I'd finished the album, I felt as if it was an end in itself. I felt, okay, this I've done.
Okay.
And I really didn't feel like doing anything else. Whereas normally when I finished an album, I might have 1 or 2 other ideas that I'm thinking of pursuing, and I'll jump into it. Because when you finish an album, there's actually a terrible feeling. There's a terrible feeling of emptiness. And so quite often, a lot of musicians feel they have to throw themselves into other albums. It's almost like a drug, in a sense. And this time round, I just let the feeling of the album linger. And since I finished this, all I've done is a couple of cover versions for fun with Brian Hulse. That's it. And in a sense, I'm waiting for that idea or that concept or that band to come, for the next project to take me by surprise.
Super. Well, it was an honor to talk to you, Tim. Thank you so much for accepting the invite on Profile. Wish you tons of success with the brand new album.
Thank you.
And thanks again.
My pleasure. Nice talking to you.
Late Night Laments will be released on August 28th on Inside Out Burning Shed. So cheers.
It's Inside Out via Sony.
Via Sony.
Although, if you want to buy it, the best place always is Burning Shed, because one of the things is with Burning Shed that obviously we do pay the musicians properly, which is one of the reasons we set it up. This is another reason which I didn't say, was that with Burning Shed, because I'd been signed to various labels, I knew how not to treat musicians. And so I knew how open and transparent contracts should be and what musicians should get from deals.
Well, I know my wallet suffers from Burning Shed. I can tell you that.
Excellent.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tim.
My pleasure.